So every time I return from my summer study month, I have the same nightmare. It's like clockwork. I'm standing before the congregation and I've completely forgotten how to lead a service. It's as if being gone for a month will erase everything that I know about ministry. I had that dream last night, and as usual, I'm just hoping that the dream is not a prophecy and is rather just an anxious fantasy. I think I'll be fine. You can let me know later. It is really good to be back, though. I'm so glad to be with you all today. Thank you. Applause for my study leave. That's wonderful. I'll take it. So this sermon is a little bit of what I did on my summer vacation. I got a really big pitcher of lemonade, a lawn chair, and bug spray, and I read some books by the novelist Thomas Mann. I was drawn to him because I thought he had an interesting biography. Born in Germany in the latter part of the 19th century, he became a celebrated writer, eventually winning the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1929. When fascism broke out in his home country, he exiled himself and his family, coming to live and write in America. He never returned home. Many say that his writing expresses some of the deepest insights about that period of history, and I would suggest that it also has some uncanny relevance today. His most famous novel, the one that I want to talk about, is called The Magic Mountain. It's a realist story, and it never strays into elaborate fantasy. Nonetheless, this lengthy book functions as something of an allegory for Western culture. In it, a young man goes to visit his cousin at a tuberculosis sanatorium high in the Swiss Alps. The majestic white building with palatial windows and sprawling terraces is where the sick go to rest and hopefully recover. The young man intends to spend 3 weeks of restful vacation in this place, but after the director of the sanatorium convinces him that he too is sick, he ends up staying as a patient for 7 years. Now, tuberculosis in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was basically an untreatable illness. There was no medication for it, and so doctors frequently prescribed rest cures, which amounted to little more than sleeping all day. They might also prescribe mountain air, which is why sanatoriums like the one in the novel were often at high elevations. These mostly well-to-do patients of these resort-like institutions would spend their time walking around on short paths, eating luxurious meals, and resting. Lots of resting. Now, Mann does not think much of these cures or the doctors who prescribe them. In the novel, the medical staff are little more than charlatans, though it is unclear whether their deception is intentional or not. But their cures clearly do not work, and the patients usually remain sick for years until either their spontaneous recovery or their eventual death. The main character is probably not even sick, and yet on each visit to the doctor says that his condition has worsened. Now, this novel is subtly but deeply political. What we see expressed by the patients in the sanatorium are many of the political positions that will come to occupy center stage in 20th century democracies. You have people who are liberals and leftists, anti-Semites and racists, authoritarian personalities, conservatives who stand for traditional values. You have the politically indifferent. You have some who have totalitarian and even fascist aspirations, and others who express complete ignorance and stupidity about the world, a libertine who cares for nothing more than the pleasures of the flesh and accumulating money, and others who desire to do away with the ideals of Western humanism. Mann's use of language is masterful, giving readers the impression that they are listening to a great public debate or speech, even when it is simply two people conversing in the sanatorium's sitting room. Now, the main character starts to follow two patients who end up becoming his mentors in the novel. One of these is Herr Settembrini, who is an Italian humanist and freedom fighter. He dedicates most of his time to writing an encyclopedia about human suffering in an attempt to help people understand and solve the pain of the world. He is perhaps the only person whose ideas are not sucked completely into the sickness of the sanatorium. I think it's interesting to note that in the novel, Settembrini escapes the sanatorium's walls. And even though he continues to be sick, he begins living in a neighboring village. I think that perhaps Mann was representing that the ideals of freedom and humanism had not been completely consumed by the sickness of the institution. The other mentor is Herr Nafta. Now, Nafta is Settembrini's nemesis and represents all of the most destructive ideas in the novel. He's simultaneously a religious reactionary and a modern fascist, someone who believes in the superiority of the church and state above human rights, and who also believes that society needs to be bathed in violence and blood in order to cleanse itself. Pages and pages are spent with Settembrini and Nafta arguing with one another. Their arguments intensify throughout the novel until they reach something of a fever pitch and end in violence in the concluding pages. So what do we make of all of this? Mann's book is first, I think, a critique of the class of people who are supposed to offer answers to society's pressing questions. In the novel, you have an institution where people who are supposed to be in the know, often intellectuals and politicians and business people, leaders of their countries, they go there to get well. And yet the cures, as I mentioned, are bogus. They're only prolonging the illness. The allegorical meaning is that the solutions or cures that the pundit class offers to society's ills should probably be distrusted. They are often unhelpful, and they are simply prolonging an illness rather than addressing its root causes. Now, Mann implies that there is a certain paralysis in this recapitulation, this turning over and over of familiar positions, and he calls this the great stupor. It's a paralysis or stupor that we have come to expect in our society, where few offer anything helpful, and instead we end up debating the same old stalemate of the same old positions, remaining sick rather than addressing the root causes of the problems that we face. I think that this is true today no less than it was when Mann was alive. If you listen to many commentators on the left and the right, you will hear the same set of pat answers to the chronic problems of American democracy. I remember my disappointment when I read a recent book that was lauded as an original contribution by a creative and thoughtful conservative. After a few chapters of recent history, it restates most of the same cultural diagnoses and solutions of the political right. Essentially, it bemoaned the fact that the United States no longer looks like it did in the 1950s, which is a fact that provokes in me neither nostalgia nor confidence in the cure that the author goes on to propose. Of course, the sanatorium in Mann's novel is not filled only with cultural conservatives. Today, one might be equally dismayed to hear yet another round of liberal outrage at the presidential administration's most recent actions, with no follow-through or attempt to reframe the conversation or slightest hint at a path forward. The second part of Mann's critique is that accompanying the great stupor or paralysis is a simultaneous intensification and increasing acrimony between sides. Mon calls this the great petulance, where the patients become agitated by their interminable lounging and sleeping all day, and they're accomplishing nothing. Here, the ideas in the novel become more vitriolic, even more violent, and the patients go so far as to start attacking each other as the novel draws to its close. An anti-Semite attacks a Jewish patient. Another man takes out his gun at inappropriate times and starts playing with it in a threatening way. Finally, in a decisive scene in the novel, Settembrini and Nafta end their arguments in a lethal duel where one of them dies. I can't help but think that we are seeing art become life, fiction become reality when we look at today's headlines. Political scientists have charted the spike in demeaning rhetoric and hate speech in recent years. This week is, of course, the anniversary of the white supremacist march in Charlottesville, which was the largest in recent history and occurred last August. Such intensification, Mon suggests, goes hand in hand with the political stalemate that we are experiencing. Now, Mon is careful not to mistake the symptom for the disease. He does not imply that the conditions in the novel were created by any one leader or even any one party. And I think that works for us as well. While it may be tempting to lay all of our problems at the feet of current political leaders, it is helpful to remember that we have experienced years of politicians who have modeled not constructive conversations, but rather acrimonious deadlock. This does not vindicate recent behaviors as much as it demonstrates the culpability of a political class, and by extension, the people who support and elect them, in the intensification of destructive political rhetoric and action. Years have been spent laying the groundwork for the worst elements to come into the political fray, and it should be no surprise that that's finally happening. Now, Thomas Mann does not give a solution to all of this. Instead, his book ends in the calamity of World War I. There he says, in an almost apocalyptic note, that the thunderbolt which shakes the earth was the deafening detonation of great destructive masses of accumulated stupor and petulance. In other words, the sickness he described in the novel had finally burst onto the scene of history and become deadly. That was Mann's last word on it. But I do not think that Mann needs to have the last word. I'm thinking about the words in the Gospel of John that Judy read today. In that story, Jesus goes to a pool where the sick show up to bathe and recover. Perhaps it was something like an ancient sanatorium, though it was not called that, I'm sure. So a person who is paralyzed is lying by the pool and cannot get up to go into the waters. When he sees Jesus, he asks for help. Now, what struck me was Jesus' response to this. Jesus did not say, "Do you know exactly what ails you?" Or, "How long have you been sick? Does it hurt?" No. Instead, Jesus says, "Do you want to get well? Do you want to get well?" That question really struck me when I read it, because often I think that there's not much political will to get well. People would prefer to restate their old positions or wring their hands or stay at home when it would be much better to show up. The answer to the rabbi's question, "Do you want to get well?" would be, for many, not really. The good news is that even in the midst of political stupor and increasing acrimony, there are signs of health. The Reverend Dr. William Barber has called for a moral revival across the United States, addressing issues of poverty and oppression. When families started to be separated at the border, people were not quiet, and the blowback caused that policy to be reversed. Last year, people showed up across the country to witness against the rally in Charlottesville for white supremacy and to stand for a more loving and inclusive country. What I find new and hopeful about these moments is that there's something of a reframing that goes beneath the stale debates and touches upon deeper moral questions. Who do we want to be? What do we want to stand for? And those questions are sometimes followed by conviction and action and an affirmation that, yes, we want to see society get well. I'd like to end with Muriel Rukeyser's poem. She writes, "I lived in the first century of world wars. It was no easy time." But her poem is neither apocalyptic nor hopeless. As she puts it, in the day I would be reminded of those men and women, brave, setting up signals across vast distances, considering a nameless way of living, of almost unimagined values. As the lights darkened and as the lights of night brightened, we would try to imagine them. We would try to find each other, to construct peace, to make love, to reconcile waking with sleeping, ourselves with each other, ourselves with ourselves, and in so doing, find a way to health and to wholeness. In the words of the gospel, for the sick to pick up their beds and walk. May that become our prayer and our act. Amen. I love you. It's good to be back today.